Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us at tonight's TrailOff launch talk with Jacob Winterstein and Adrienne Mackey. I'm Katy Dammers, an artistic producer here at FringeArts, and I want to thank you for joining us for what is, for the most part, the last night of our 2020 Fringe Festival. There are still, programs that will continue throughout the rest of the month and the rest of the year. TrailOff is one of them. Just because today is our last public talk, know that the app itself is certainly available for the next year. That being said, we really appreciate you joining us on this journey to what has been a primarily, though not exclusively, digital festival this year. In the wake of the coronavirus and wanting to put everybody's health and safety first, we've shifted a number of programs online, including this one, and really appreciate you making the leap with us. We want to remind you that we're recording tonight's talk, and we'll be putting the recording on our website and our YouTube page early this next week. So I encourage you to share that with your friends and your family, and know that it'll be there for you to reference, along with 10 other talks that we've done with each of the different TrailOff authors and the collaborative artistic team. So lots of great content for you to check out. Before we begin today, I just want to do some brief Zoom housekeeping. You are attending this talk in Zoom. It's an online platform that I'm sure most of us are familiar with. But just as some notes about how we'll be orienting ourselves to it today, we ask that you keep your microphone off so that you're not emitting sound. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a toolbar, and all the way on the left-hand side, you'll see a microphone. You'll want to make sure that there's a red line through that, indicating that it's off. We also have closed captioning available for this talk, so if you'd like to enable that, you can click the small button labeled CC in that same bottom toolbar. You're also welcome to use the chat throughout. Our panelists will be speaking for the most of today's talk, but you're welcome to ask questions in there or respond and participate as you'd like. So without further ado, I want to introduce Adrienne and Jacob. They can tell you a little bit about TrailOff, an incredible collaborative project kind of made by a large community, but primarily Adrienne Mackey of Swim Pony, the Pennsylvania Environmental Council, Michael Kiley, and Toaster Lab. This is an exciting transmedial experience, and it's a geolocated app, which is now available for download on iOS and coming soon for Android. So we'll make sure that that link is put in the chat. We hope you can download the app. There are then 10 new contemporary stories that have been commissioned specifically for some of the circuit trails in the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania region. You then get yourself to one of those trails, and as you walk throughout the space, the story will unfold via your headphones. It's a pretty amazing experience, and is something that, as I mentioned before, is accessible for the next year. So I hope you'll take an opportunity to try it out and hear more about Jacob's tutorial now. Thanks.
Thanks, Katy. Hi, Jacob.
Hello, hello, hello.
So as Katy mentioned, TrailOff and Swim Pony and the Pennsylvania Environmental Council are partnering with FringeArts for our launch month. This is the last of our artist talks, and I'm really excited because it's actually the first story we finished in the recording studio and mixing and editing. So it's sort of fun to bookend it as the final one that we're gonna talk about. And so as Katy mentioned, I'm joined by Jacob Winterstein, writer of The Land Remembers. And this piece was created for the Heinz Wildlife Refuge at Tinicum near the Eastwood neighborhood in Philly. So, Jacob, if you're okay, I'm going to read your bio
Go for it.
to the gathered public so they get a little bit about you. So Jacob Winterstein is an artist, event producer, and educator from Philadelphia. Through performance art, poetry, and events, Jacob's work explores how we have been separated from and how we can joyfully connect with each other and our environments. Jacob is the co-founder of the Philly Pigeon Collective, which organizes poetry slams, multimedia productions, workshops, and artist retreats. Jacob is currently attempting a pilgrimage, bicycling down every block in Philadelphia.
You know, I wish I was, but you know,
No.
COVID has put many things on hold. Yeah.
So I mentioned this before everybody jumped onto the Zoom call, that I actually was reading your interview or your application for this project from 2 long years ago.
Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me in revisiting what you wrote way back when was actually how much of it made it into the final story, but especially that you mentioned being both an avid traveler and really a rooted community member at the same time. And that place was really at the center of your work in so many areas of what you do. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about what your creative life before TrailOff was, like what kinds of projects do you work on? Like what kind of work do you do at the Pigeon, and how do these themes emerge
Yeah.
in different things you've made?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite people is in the Zoom room with us, Dawn Pratson. And I don't think I would have answered this question this way, but because she's here, I'll try to tie it all in together. So when I was, I think like 22 or something, like one of my first jobs outside of college was I was a substitute teacher. And I would get a call every morning and they'd send me to a different school. And then one day I get sent to this folk arts and cultural treasure school in Chinatown. And Dawn Pratson was the music teacher, and she had these like huge 3-person choirs, sorry, 3-class choirs. So like a kindergarten class, a first grade class, and a second grade class all in the room at the same time. And my job was to be the assistant and just like handle some of the discipline stuff while Dawn taught music. And I think I also like maybe taught like one kindergarten class music. And at the end of my first day, I knew that the position that I was filling that day was actually vacant. I said to Dawn, I said, hey, I can't sing. I have like very bad rhythm, but I'm a poet and I really liked working with you. I really like this school. I would be really delighted to stay if you'd have me. And Dawn was generous enough to have me. And we got to do like choral spoken word pieces with the students. So I got to bring some of my spoken word background into that space, and some of my performance poetry background into that space. And right after that, I think I was there just for the winter. And right after that, working with Dawn, I went to travel for 6 months. As I mentioned in my application 2 years ago, that I'm an avid traveler. And one of the part of that trip that I took was retracing the route that my grandfather's family took to escape the Nazis from Belgrade, what's now Serbia, what was then Yugoslavia, down to the coast through Bosnia into Croatia, then up the coast of Croatia and into Italy. And then I walked through the Alps mountains into Switzerland, where my family was able to find refuge before they eventually got visas to come to the United States. And so I think that was, I did a lot of writing along the way, and just basically in the form of emails, but like emails that I took a really long time to write people. And so, was kind of journaling my experience through email. And it was this first time I've been writing for probably 10 years at that point, but that was the first time I think where writing and place were equal parts of the practice, that I had to move through the space that I was moving through to have the thing to write about. And I needed to write to digest the experiences that I was having on this trip. And I don't think I would have described it this way at this time, but I think what I was going through was a pilgrimage. It was like a coming of age pilgrimage. It was a pilgrimage to understand my family. It was a pilgrimage to understand my roots. And I think one of the things I learned on that trip was, I was like, I want to make my home the type of place that if a traveler passed through, they'd be like, wow, this is an amazing place. I also got rejected from a Fulbright while I was on that trip, so I didn't have a choice. I had to go home. But it was a nice, I think that rejection was helpful because and that trip was helpful in kind of clarifying, like, there's lots of amazing places in the world, and with better food than Philadelphia, with better environs than Philadelphia, better public transportation than Philadelphia. There's a lot of amazing, beautiful places in the world, but there's no place where I could create space and create and create the type of experiences that I would have wanted to experience if I was out traveling somewhere. So I think that's been a lot of my work in Philly. The Pigeon is a monthly poetry slam where in pre-COVID times, 150 people would pack a sweaty room to watch poetry and dance and laugh and cry and listen intently together. And then also my own writing and own performing and time on stage. And then to tie it all back into this project, a few years ago, I started a pilgrimage here in Philadelphia where I was like, what would it be like to travel in my own city, to move through the city in a way that is not utilitarian, to not get from point A to point B. And so I started a pilgrimage where I'm attempting to bicycle down every block in Philadelphia. And as I'm bicycling, I'm towing a trailer. It's a mobile altar. It's like 6 feet long. It has these sticks sticking up on it. And I'm asking people the question, how do you heal? And they write their answers on this white streamer and they attach it to this trailer. And so the first neighborhood that I've bicycled down every block in is the Eastwood neighborhood of Philadelphia, where Tinicum is. And when I was down there, there's huge vacant, empty plots of land. And as an undergrad, I studied geography and urban studies. And so when I'm moving through a neighborhood and I see these huge swaths, like multiple football fields of empty land, I'm like, oh, something happened here, or something didn't happen here, or something happened and then didn't happen here. And so I started to research the history of the Eastwood neighborhood. And so when I was accepted into TrailOff and I was asked which trails I was called to, I was really called to to Tinicum because I'd already spent a lot of time in that neighborhood and started to delve into the history a little bit of that neighborhood.
It's funny. I said I wasn't going to pull any quotes from your application, but I actually did have one. And it's interesting just hearing you talk about that. This one specifically where you said, my writing explores how the plants, concrete, sky, rivers, streets, and buildings in our environment shape who we become. And it's just really interesting to hear you tell that story about sort of the arc of all of those different projects. I don't know if we ever actually talked about this, but the kind of ancestral project to TrailOff was actually a long walk that I did called Walk Around Philadelphia, right, where JJ Tizu has kind of taken the project since we originally built it as part of a swim pony kind of experimental project through a program called cross-pollination. But in a very similar way, you know, it was a group of artists taking a walk around the perimeter of the city, and it really challenged me to go, you know, what would it mean for me to think about the place I live from the edges rather than the center? And how do I feel myself a tourist in a place that I ostensibly think I know really well? And in maybe even in a deeper way, as a thinking of it, you know, if you just put the frame of artistic stage around an experience, something that might otherwise be unremarkable or banal suddenly can be elevated into this really poetic and beautiful space. And it's like, it was one of those things that kind of just like, after all of this time, like raising money and doing these big fancy projects on stages, you know, and like building invented worlds, I was like, oh, I just have to go outside and actually look at things. Like that's all it takes.
Yeah. I think it's like the superpower of artists is that like we just bring if you bring intentionality to an experience and meaning to the experience, that it can transform like what you described as banal or everyday. I think that's what's so awesome about TrailOff is that it's just that it's the years of work on your part of the team, but it's also just, you know, people bringing intention and meaning and saying that there's something here beyond maybe your senses would have initially absorbed.
Yeah. I'm interested, I mean, you touched on this a little bit, but is there anything else that you can add to like what specifically drew you to be a part of TrailOff? Like, was there anything that, you know, going into the project or in early conversations that we had where you were like, oh, like this is the thing that really makes me want to get involved in this?
Yeah, I think in my poetry, I try to, I try to give life to the environment. So like I will have plants speak in my poem. I'll have the telephone wires participate in action that's happening. You know, the street will transform into a parade. And so I think the idea of like being of being able to have someone walk through space and then have a story unfold in their ears was like the technological version of what I been had been doing in my creative practice. And so I think like that, like the experience of the place coming alive in a new way was what was one of the things that really excited me. And then I think also saying that place is important, that places that like where your feet are in the moment has meaning beyond just the present moment, that like that anywhere we stand has a rich history to it, has a biological history, has a human history, has a social history, has a political history. And so to be able to weave all that into someone's like walk and moving through the city is exciting for that moment that they're doing it. And then also I think invites the listener into a way of moving through the city at any time, and at any moment you can stop and imagine like, what was it like here 100 years ago, what was it like 200 years ago, what was it like here 1,000 years ago, and that's a game that one can play all of the time. So I think it was both the like excitement of the project itself and the invitation for me, and the invitation we as the storytellers are giving to the listeners to like invite imagination and intention and meaning into walking.
Well, why don't we, if you're up for it, listen to a little clip from the story. So this is at the very beginning for folks. Well, nobody's heard it yet on the trail because unfortunately, as folks may have seen if they try to go down to this story, Heinz suffered some damage after the recent tropical storm in August. So this is maybe the world premiere of this chunk of the story.
Nice.
So this is right at the beginning where our main character is kind of introducing the space. So Katy, if you want to give us a little clip there.
Yeah, here we go.
Leaving Levittown feels like letting the stale air out of the end of a breath-holding contest. My mom knows I hate Levittown and finds reasons for why we need to go back to the meadows most Sundays, help another family move, pick the vegetables out of an overgrown garden someone had to leave behind, let an old neighbor borrow our car so they can drive around looking for their next place to live. Levittown is temporary, Mom says. And I hope that's true because the trees are only as tall and thick as baseball bats. And there are no streams, but everybody has a driveway. On the weekend, you can't hear anything but lawnmowers crawling across empty lawns. No one has a bramble fence, or a garden, or a fish gutting table, a blackberry bush, or a peach tree, or even a worn-down patch of dirt under a rope swing. The houses are all alone on islands of grass. No one shares a wall. The walls are all white. There's no red brick, yellow wood windows, or blue porches. Just black roads, green lawns, and white houses.
I'm so struck because I know the space that you're in when you're listening to that. Just the contrast of what you're describing in the story compared to kind of like the lush, verdant space that's like spreading around you actually on the trail. And I should give a shout out to Simon Kiley, who is actually the son of our sound designer and composer who plays the lead character there. So I'm interested if you want to talk a little bit about, specifically actually about the space and the parts of the refuge that you chose to highlight in the story, and particularly like what things drew you to, because authors across all the stories really get to pick what parts of the trails they wanted to write to. So I'm interested if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that opening piece that you play happens as the listener, if my memory serves me correctly, is walking out of the parking lot along the road, right? And the John Heinz National Wildlife Refuge is just an incredible oasis. I mean, it's just an amazing place with stunning views, incredible wildlife. I mean, it's just such a gem, and we're so lucky to have it in Philadelphia. And so I was like, I can't believe I'm just taking people on the road. Like they just got to this beautiful place, and I'm like, I want you to walk through the parking lot along the road. But I wanted to do that because roads and the national highway system and the federal funding of the suburbs at the same time that cities were being divested from is such an important part of American history, and is such an important, like, and is one of the lasting legacies of one of the most enduring legacies of racism in our country. And so I wanted people to walk on the road and walk on the asphalt and walk on like maybe one of the like less appealing parts of the trail while meditating on or listening to this description of a newly built suburban subdivision, Levittown, which was famous and replicated across the country, and was also known for discriminating against Black people and not letting Black people buy houses in Levittown, and creating clauses where people couldn't sell to Black people in Levittown. So I wanted folks to walk on the asphalt and on the road because of the history of the national highway system and the subsidies to build the suburbs, and and to juxtapose that with what's right next to the road, which is like a butterfly habitat or something, which is like this beautiful meadow and fields. And so I think, the everything that has been built had to just destroy something that was there before. And so I think like the road next to the meadow is a place where you can see, like, we could have roads or we could have meadows, and so that with roads comes great convenience and opportunity for some, and also it comes destruction. So I wanted to just start the piece off right away physically with that juxtaposition, and then it unfolds as the story continues.
Were there any other spots that felt particularly iconic of Heinz in their place in the story?
Yeah, the Heinz has these cool boardwalk systems where you can walk out over the wetlands and over, I don't know if they call it a pond or a lake, but you can walk through wetlands, and then there's the giant boardwalk, or the great boardwalk, that stretches across one of the bigger pieces of water. And that just feels like such a important part of Heinz, because, as I learned working there, a wildlife refuge is meant for the wildlife first and for the human second. And so the boardwalks there are a real, like, treat to us humans, where we get to be in this space that we normally don't get to be in. And so there's a moment in the story where you're walking in the woods and it's kind of dense, and then you walk out onto a boardwalk and the sky just opens up, and you get to see this enormous expanse of sky that's normally difficult to see anywhere in the city. And then you're kind of standing on water in a way. And so I think that was a spot that really spoke to me and really called out to me when I was walking on the trail. And I think also in a subtle way made me think about, like, what does it mean to be a guest in this space? Like, I'm clearly not supposed to be on top of the water. Like, we had to do some things so I can walk on top of the water. So that was my whole experience being at Heinz, was feeling like a very, like, honored and grateful guest, and walking along the boardwalks, I think enhances that feeling for me.
Can you tell us anything else about the research and writing process? What were, you talked a little bit about some of the themes you were drawing on, but were there any particular experiences you had that influenced it while you were creating? Were there people that you met with, things like that?
Yeah, I did some like, I guess, more academic research. Like I read some articles that some folks sent me. I found like I found like some really grainy old footage on YouTube from like folks like who used to live in that neighborhood's home movies. And then I embedded with a summer camp there. Like John Heinz hosts a summer camp, and I got to hang out with some really awesome young people for about a week and got to bring some of my camp counselor skills of past, and also just got to watch them and listen to them and hear their awe and excitement for nature, and just the type of questions they were asking and the things that they got excited about. And then I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Terry Williams that still lives in that neighborhood and grew up in that neighborhood. And then I interviewed people that just love John Heinz. Her last name's escaping me, but Miss Wanda is one of their frequent volunteers there. And John Heinz just has an incredible group of volunteers that are really committed to that place, and people love that land, and people have loved that land for a long time, and people have fought really hard to have that land be preserved. And the deep love that people have for that land it was really inspiring to a lot of parts of the story. And so a lot of those conversations I had with people like wove their way into the conversations in small ways, and sometimes large ways. And there was one gentleman who, like, every time I walked the trail, like he was retired, he was just fishing at the same spot every single time I was there. And I feel like somebody's gonna be walking and listening to the trail, and he's gonna be there fishing, and they're like, "Is that you? Are you Mr. Johnson?" And he's like, "No, that's not me." So I got to just like slowly talk to him, and by the end, like, read the fishing scene to him and like got his approval, and he liked it. So yeah, there was like intentional research and conversations that I set up, and then also a lot of serendipitous conversations where when you walk around with a clipboard, as you know, people start asking you questions. And so the clipboard is a great tool for when I wanted to interact.
You mentioned, well, we got to hear a little bit from the main character, Abe, in the first clip, and you mentioned the character, Mr. Johnson. I wonder, maybe you can give us just like a very tiny overview of sort of like the structure of the plot, and if there are any other influences either on like some of the other characters that people might encounter.
Yeah, so sorry for that noise if you heard it. So so it opens with Abe returning to his old neighborhood, and he kind of alludes to displacement and destruction that has happened. And as Abe is walking along the trail, he's reminiscing about different things that happened at different spots along the trail. And the reminiscing is centered around his crew of friends. And that for me was really based on, like, I don't like, memory is funny. Like, I don't know if it was a month of my life. I don't know if it was years of my life, but there was like this golden age where I was old enough that I could explore my neighborhood by myself, but young enough that I didn't have any responsibilities. And I just like had this crew of guy friends, of boyfriends that like we built ramps and jumped off our bicycles off the ramps, and we like got in snowball fights, and we played basketball, and we like played manhunt in the alleys, and we were like this, and we were in and out of each other's houses and knew each other's parents and played baseball together. And our somebody's dad told us about half-ball, which is like a Philadelphia stickball game that nobody plays anymore. And we tried half-ball one time. And so there was like this time that was maybe spanned at least a year, if not more, where I had this crew of playmates, and the neighborhood was just kind of open to us. And so as Abe is walking through Heinz, what he calls the park, he talks about his crew of friends that he goes to the park with, and the adventures and experiences that they have together.
Well, it was interesting too, because I don't know that I necessarily had any expectation about any particular writer when we brought folks on, but I remember that I remember you talking about like sort of choosing the perspective of Abe as like the central character in the story. And you can tell me if you disagree with this, but it seems like it's like maybe a departure from the writing style that is like the bulk of your work, with the pigeon or places like that. And I wonder like what was the process of like kind of taking on this like particular character's perspective as the central narrator?
Yeah, it was partly it was partly functional to write from the perspective of a child. Like you did a great job fundraising and like we got paid well, but it also wasn't like it was an unlimited budget and I could work on this project for like a year. And once I dug into the history of Eastwick, of what's was also known as the Meadows, and its destruction, I felt a great sense of responsibility to honor this history, but I didn't have the time to honor the history. So I was like, how can I give myself permission as the writer to not be an authority and to not know all of the history and to not know all of the stories and to not have significant relationships with the people who live there or who are from there. How can I honor the people and places that make up that neighborhood without really having the time to do that in the way that I would like? And so I think writing from the perspective of a child gave me permission to be like, okay, there's a lot I don't know. And that just opened up a world for me. When at first I was like, I have to include this and this and this and this and this and this and this, and then once I gave myself permission to be like, okay, I don't know and I'm never gonna know and I can't capture all that needs to be documented here, that my role is just to see this through one lens, then the story actually opened up in a really big way. And I think hanging out with the kids allowed me to, embedding at that summer camp at John Heinz for a week, I was like, these young people are brilliant, as all young people are. These young people are excited, they're curious, and they know so much more than I do, and they also don't know so many things that I know. And so it was just like a nice reminder where I could where Abe the character can be brilliant and notice really sophisticated things that are happening in his community, and then also can be really oblivious and ignorant to what's happening, and that all of that can exist at the same time. So that's how I started. And then it was just a nice chance to be reflective and autobiographical. Abe is a Jewish kid growing up in a racially integrated neighborhood in Philadelphia and has a relative amount of freedom to explore his world. And I'm a Jewish kid who grew up in racially integrated Mount Airy in the 90s, and I had some freedom to explore my world. So it was also just a nice opportunity to reflect and delve into my own life and use my own experiences to inform the story.
I'm going to have Katy play a second clip. This is kind of in the middle of the story when Abe is talking to Mr. Johnson.
All right, here we go.
I do remember Mr. Johnson telling me something that felt like what people say to me about my dad. I remember him trying to make me feel better, but I didn't know exactly what he meant. He said, "Look out across the banks. See the leaves and dirt in the branches? That's from the flood we had in the spring. All of this land used to be marshes, and a lot of this land still thinks it is. You see where the bank hangs over the mud like a porch roof? That's where the water is during high tide. But you know that. The land remembers. The land remembers 30 minutes ago, and the land remembers 300 years ago. The land remembers the Lenape, the Indians that lived here before they got pushed out west. And the land remembers the Africans who knew how to make a home and grow rice in any delta or marsh. The ones who saw the cattails growing on the Delaware and knew they were open doors up this creek on their way to freedom. The land remembers the Swedes and the Danish who build the dikes that hold the pond. And they remember the gypsies, the Roma, who could make an old tree into lawn furniture for the whole neighborhood. Mr. Johnson went on and said that if I was good to the land, it would remember me and I could come back to it whenever I wanted. And that no matter what the city did to the meadows, they couldn't take the land's memory. It felt like when people said to me that my dad is always watching me and I can talk to him whenever I want. I don't know if that's all true, but it feels good to think about sometimes.
Simon did such a great job. Your mic's off, Adrienne. I think you're still
I was
muted.
muted. Sorry
There
about
you
that.
go.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of it was a really interesting experience because this was the story where we really piloted what the recording process was going to look like. You know, and I'm used to working in theater, so I'm used to getting like a lot of tries at something, and so it was really crazy to just be like, well, we're gonna, and the whole thing actually happened in Mike Kiley's basement. He has a recording studio, you know, so we sort of like went down. We had one day, and then it was all done.
Wow.
Which feels like it's interesting. This project in some ways is like so big and so massive, but it happens in such tiny, small interactions over time. I'm interested to know what it's like to hear the story, like that clip of the story after like so long from being in the middle of working on it.
Yeah, I don't know, it makes me tear up a little bit. It's just such a sweet, you know, it's like a chance to hear like a version of myself in the past who like also like has the benefit of a really great script writer. It's like, you know, it's like a little bit of like a little movie version of like myself. I was like, man, like, yeah, I wish, you know, because I did have Mr. Johnson like characters in my life. You know, they weren't that clean with the messages, but so and also it reminds me of a small moment that I had with Terry Williams, where I was sitting at a picnic table in his side yard, and he was about to tell me his life story, and he was like, but before we do that, I need to say that my life, that before I got here, the Lenape were here. And then he kind of went through that list for me just before we started talking about his life living in the meadows. So so it's, listening to it is nostalgic for me for my own life, but also just those small moments I got to have in the process of writing it, where I got invited into his yard, where, you know, I had just so many beautiful conversations with people because people love that land so much that once you ask somebody about what they love and why they love it, you're going to have a really beautiful conversation together. And then you're going to have a really intimate conversation together. And so I felt so grateful throughout the experience of writing it that I got to just say to people, hey, I'm writing about this place. Can you tell me why you love it and what it means to you? And then I would get to have these beautiful, intimate, connected, hour-long conversations with strangers. And in a way that I don't know how I would have accessed that experience otherwise. So yeah, so that piece is directly connected to a conversation I had with Terry, and I think also came out of the conversations that we had as writers when you brought us all together in the beginning of the process, where we were just talking about the importance of like honoring the indigenous folks who lived on this land before they were forcibly displaced, and that once we honor them, then we don't just skip to the present. There's a whole group of other folks that need to be honored and remembered. And I think anytime we take a moment to honor and remember those who came before us, for me is a moment of feeling like connected and like purposeful in the present.
It's so interesting, this story. I mean, I think many of the TrailOff stories do this, but I feel like this one in particular has this really particular quality of feeling like a memory you didn't know you had as you're walking through the space. I'm interested, I think particularly because, this piece is in some way, it's like pointing at a systemic issue within the larger culture through like a really intimate personal narrative, and you're also in the literal place that the story is talking about. And I'm interested to know, I'm not going to say if, I'm just going to say how you think a project like TrailOff, or one sort of similar to the Every Black in Philly piece you were talking about, like how do these projects that marry art and experience and nature, like being in physical space with an artistic mindset, like how do these things explore some of these really large systemic issues, maybe in ways that like traditional advocacy might not reach people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that almost, I'll say anywhere in America, the land is a reflection of values as implemented through like public policy. Even untouched land is land that we have intended to leave untouched. So any land in this country is a reflection of public policy. And so the meadows, that neighborhood was forcibly destroyed by the federal government in the 1950s through what they called urban renewal. And so they said this area is blighted and it needs to be rebuilt. And in order to rebuild it, everyone who lives here needs to leave. And so through eminent domain and through block busting, through like buying houses and then leaving them vacant and then plunging everybody's property values and things like that, they were able to displace like maybe upwards of 10,000 people from their neighborhood. And so, and it was a neighborhood that at the time was one of the only harmoniously integrated neighborhoods in the city. At that same time, in Delaware County, the National Guard was being called in because a Black family moved into a white neighborhood and white people almost rioted. In Southwest Philadelphia, as recently as the 1980s, there was a riot when an interracial couple moved into Southwest Philadelphia, and so into predominantly white part of Southwest Philadelphia. So I think that ideally the story connects us to the human experience and allows us to imagine what it might be like to have our neighborhood be destroyed. And then the process of walking the space ideally invites the listener to imagine what other spaces have been shaped by what other policies and experiences. And then I hope that some of the like subtle and not subtle like references to the historical experiences that happened to folks that lived in the meadows makes us think about the present and how is displacement happening now? How is racism through housing policies still affecting our lives? How are how is like land management and development and gentrification a continuation of a legacy of racism through housing policies? So I think art projects like this, I think hopefully make you care about the characters. And then once you care about the characters, hopefully that opens up a window to just caring about the real people who are around you. And then, I've been an organizer since I was 15. I cut my teeth doing like anti-privatization organizing in Philadelphia when I was in high school. And so like it's hard for me to make art that doesn't have like something in there that's political. And so hopefully, it strikes that balance of being something that stands alone as a piece of artwork, but also invites a level of critical thinking about our current conditions.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, you know, I think on the most fundamental level, this was actually the pitch that I made to the Pennsylvania Environmental Council. You know, they'd never done arts programming before TrailOff, and they were kind of like, why art?
It's a question we have to answer for a lot of people.
You know, and part of the pitch was this thing around like, you know, if people tell themselves the story, like if you close your eyes and say, what is the story of the environmental movement, right? Like you have a picture of who belongs in public natural spaces, and it's a pretty limited picture. And if we're actually going to be in a space where we want to be responsible environmental stewards of the future, like we're not going to be able to do it unless everybody gets on board. And if people don't feel welcome and seen in those spaces because the dominant story excludes them, like we're cutting out like the vast, incredible resources of perspective that are going to help us really think differently about these really hard and complicated problems.
Yeah.
So, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think John Heinz is that the staff there really really takes seriously their responsibility as being a wildlife refuge in the middle of the city, and bringing folks from their community who surround John Heinz into the refuge, and making sure that not only are they welcomed, but that they're actively invited. I just think that the staff down there, through all of their programming, just does a phenomenal job at making sure that it's not an island or an oasis, but it's actually a part that is integrated into the community through not just the driveway and the road, but through programming and through deep and meaningful relationships. And so I think that also was just inspiring in writing the piece, was that the community that surrounds John Heinz as a wildlife refuge is such a vibrant, strong, diverse, fierce community. And so that kind of gave me a jumping off point to write about the historical community of the Meadows and the people that used to live in the surrounding neighborhood.
I'm gonna play our last clip from the story. This is near the end, where, if I remember correctly, Abe is revisiting the Meadows after kind of leaving it, and he'll say the name of which friend, I can't remember which of his two friends it is, and they are, I think, actually out on that section of the boardwalk that you were talking about at the beginning. And when you're actually on the trail, you're standing in this space, kind of like, as you were talking about, like standing on the water right in the middle, looking out at this giant expanse of sky.
All right, here we go.
We stopped paddling right here and just let the raft float. It barely moved. I looked back towards the Meadows, at the part of the pond I imagine has always looked the same. Ox looked the other way, towards the airport. He wondered if flying felt like sitting on a raft. If sitting on the air felt like sitting on the water. I asked Ox why the pond was his favorite part of the park. He said it's like an outdoor movie theater that never plays the same picture twice. Like the time we saw two bald eagles attack that big bird with a fish in its claws. Or the time we saw a bird as big as a plane take off from behind a clump of cattails. Or the time we saw a bird that wasn't even bigger than my fist chase a hawk over the lake and past the trees. The last time Ox and me were here, we laid so still on this raft that the small birds forgot we were here and landed right next to us. That day, when the sun went and hid behind the trees, Ox picked up his paddle. It felt like he just had to pull the paddle through the water twice to take us from the middle of the pond all the way back to the banks.
The first time I tested this story in space, I was listening to that section And I like actually had this like magical moment where there were two birds that just like started flying around my head in the middle of it. And I was like,
Nice.
okay, I think we're onto something here.
That's awesome. And if you stand there long enough and you're still enough, the birds will start to land on the railing of the boardwalk too. In the right season, you know, everything's got to line up, but it's going to happen to someone.
Yeah. So we're almost at time here. And I just wonder, maybe as like sort of the final thought to leave folks with, if there's anything in particular that you hope people take away from the experience of walking this trail and listening to this story.
I hope that folks think about the place that's important to them and how it became the way it is now. I think that it's easy to feel disconnected from history, and that like the moment we live in is just its own standalone moment, which is like a beautiful sentiment from like a meditation standpoint. And also the moment we stand in is like standing on top of an uncountable amount of moments before that. So I hope it'll encourage reflection, not necessarily about Eastwick. You know, if folks want to like learn more about Eastwick, it's an amazing place to learn about. But I think, you know, think about a place that folks care about, and hopefully it'll encourage them to learn a little bit more about what happened there before.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob Winterstein. This was such a pleasure.
This
I'm
was
like,
so great.
I feel like I'm always like from the very first conversation that we had about this project, I've just been like, I don't know, just illuminated and stimulated, and just always makes me like want to reflect more and sort of like connect back to the kind of core values of like why this project exists in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you again. Like this, the vision and the level of intention all the way throughout. You know, I've never. I had some questions I wanted to ask you. You know, I'll ask you offline. But just the intention, the intentionality and the freedom and permission, like the level of freedom that you gave the artists, and support, like that balance that you were able to achieve, just makes me so excited to hit the trail, because I just know that you put people in the position to shine their best selves onto this project, and that, you know, the little tidbits that I've heard have been amazing. And so I'm just so excited, and I can only imagine the amount of spreadsheets and planning and grants and all of the unseen and unappreciated parts that go into making a beautiful piece like this. And I hope a lot of people get to experience the final product. I really do.
Yeah. Well, as Katy mentioned at the top, TrailOff is kind of coming to the end of its launch month. But if you visit www.trailoff.com, you can sign up to get updates. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. And you can download the app on iOS already. Android is coming very, very soon. And there's probably going to be a new update on iOS that fixes a couple little bugs we found over the course of the launch month. And it'll be available for an entire year. So you best all be ready for when the spring comes. We're going to do another big push out there. And the Land Remembers will be up and available to walk literally as soon as I can get my feet on the trail. And it's open again. So thank you so much. And yeah, have a wonderful evening.